All right, the Mexican national era. We've, of course, looked at how Mexico became independent from Spain. And at that point, Texas was part of Mexico. Of course, the Spaniards had never really been that interested in Texas, except as a border area, as a border zone, as a sort of a wall to keep other Europeans out of their rich stuff, the gold and silver mines in Mexico and Central and South America. And they really didn't have much to show at the end of 300 years of Spanish rule for Texas. They, of course, they had transferred their customs and their language. And, of course, they had transferred their animals and some of their diseases as well. But you basically had Nacogdoches and San Antonio and Goliad and El Paso as far as the infrastructure of Texas, or the cities of Texas, along with several pathways that they called roads to those areas. And now it's time for this new country, Mexico, to take over Texas. Meanwhile, as the revolution movement gained power in Mexico against Spain, and eventually, of course, was successful in separating Mexico from Spain, back in the United States, there had been an economic depression. Many people lost their jobs, and people didn't have money to spend. One of those people was Moses Austin, who up until that time had been a successful businessman. He had been called the Lead King in Virginia for his setting up a little village that smelted and made lead items. And after the Depression, Moses Austin moved to Missouri, which was in Spanish. And then after the 1803, the French selling of Louisiana Purchase area to the United States, Missouri became part of the United States. Unfortunately, again, because of business interest failures, because of the Panic of 1819, Moses Austin had basically lost most of his money that had been built up over years before. And so he decided that perhaps it was time for a venture in the Texas area, which was, again, part of Mexico. So Moses Austin traveled to San Antonio, Texas, spoke to the Mexican governor of Texas at the time, and proposed sort of a venture with, of course, Moses Austin basically leading some people to Texas who would help build up Texas for the Spanish at this time, because by 1820, of course, Texas was still part of the Spanish territory. The final settlement between the Mexican revolutionaries and the Spanish government hadn't yet come through. And so the Spanish governor of San Antonio basically said, well, I can't actually okay this deal. I'll have to send word back to Mexico City, and they'll have to do that. And so Moses Austin traveled back up to Missouri, and when he was there, he became ill, but the Spanish governor had sent a messenger, and just before he died, Moses Austin was told the Spanish government in Mexico City had okayed his land grant, his basically a contract to bring people into Texas. But Moses Austin knew he was dying, and so he basically sent a message to his son, Stephen F. Austin, who was then in New Orleans, to basically take over this grant. So Moses Austin actually received permission to build an Anglo settlement in Texas, but became ill and died before he could make it a reality. So it's going to be left to Moses Austin's son, Stephen F. Austin, to carry out his father's plans in Texas. Of course, there's many fine statues of Stephen F. Austin, perhaps the largest of Texas, which rivals the height of the Sam Houston statue, which is, of course, going north of Houston to Dallas. But down in Brazoria County, there's a very large statue of Stephen Austin, showing him with his trusty rifle and his frontier garb, settling Texas. So Stephen F. Austin chose some land for this new colony, and this land would be located on a coastal plain between the Colorado and Brazos River, which is ideal for farming. Water, of course, was extremely important for crop growth. And if there was a shortage of rain, rivers became even more important for crop growth. Of course, rivers could also be useful for transportation from one place to another, up and down the rivers, as well as for some other items as well. So basically, starting a colony near a river was sort of a must at the time, and he chose the Colorado and Brazos River, sort of the area between the two, which would ensure that his land would be well watered one way or another, either with rain or without it. And eventually the area that he produced helped make Texas a great agricultural center of the West at the time. So there's a map. Of course, you can see the area that he acquired between the two rivers. Of course, the northern area is closest to us in Brazoria County. And of course, then his land grant went further south along the coast of Texas and then inland as well. Of course, on this map, you can actually see some roads eventually there would be, and roads meaning dirt paths, and some settlements there as well. So Austin began advertising for settlers and specifically sought hard-working, responsible people. He knew to be successful, he was going to have some successful people, people that were willing to work hard. This was going to be a frontier wilderness. You would not have major cities. You would probably not have, for example, doctors available to you, at least not in any good length of time. You, of course, would also have to build up trading areas, et cetera, et cetera. So he wanted people to come in this for a long term. He wanted people to be serious about when they signed up, they were going to be there, they were going to stay there, they were going to build this area up. Of course, many people were attracted by the inexpensive land and the opportunity to start fresh in a new place. That was especially true of many Americans at the time in 1819, the Panic of 1819, which is almost like a Great Depression. At the time, if you could not pay your debts, you were thrown in jail and basically kept there until you could pay your debts, or obviously until someone else paid your debts for you. So many Americans, because of the sort of the depression or economic downturn, the panic as it was called, they were eager to leave portions of the United States so they would not be thrown in jail for non-payment of debts. Plus, many had lost their businesses, and they had very little to basically stay in the area for. So many people were attracted to this area for the very inexpensive land, and of course it's going to have to be inexpensive, especially if you don't have any money, especially if you're bankrupt already, and for a place to start fresh, especially since this is Spanish Texas. And at the time, the United States didn't have extradition agreements with the Spaniards, which meant that, for example, if you had committed crimes in the United States, coming to Texas would be a place where you could rest, knowing that the U.S. authorities were not going to arrest you here, or the Spanish authorities were not going to arrest you and send you back to the United States. So all sorts of people were interested in coming to Texas from the United States, which is interesting because the Spanish had tried for 300 years to get people to move into Texas, and basically no one wanted to come. And seriously, they had tried many different European populations to try to attract them to Texas, but basically all of them said, no, we don't want to come. And of course, people from what we now know as Mexico had moved into the area, but even then, they recognized this was not the best growing land available. They recognized they were far from, for example, Mexico City, and it was even hard to attract many Mexicans into Texas. So probably at the at the end of Spanish rule in 1821, there were probably around 4,000 what we would call Mexican citizens now living in Texas. So under Austin's plan, every free man in the colony would receive 640 acres of land. Plus, if he was married, he'd get 320 acres of land, in addition to his 640, because of his wife. And for each child, that would be 160 acres. And if he had an enslaved person, that would be another 80 acres of land. So you can see if you had a large family, especially, you could get a lot of land for very little money. Austin had settlers pay him 12.5 cents per acre of land. And this was basically only 1/10 of the land cost in the United States at the time. He needed the money to pay for legal requirements for the land. That is, once he gave the land to you, it was Spanish land, so he would have to file the appropriate paperwork. He would have to travel to one of the state capitals, or perhaps even Mexico City itself, to file the paperwork, and it was going to cost money simply in order to run this colony. So the 12.5 cents per acre was basically not to make him rich, but basically so he wouldn't have to pay out-of-pocket expenses, so that this would be a self-fulfilling prophecy, a prophecy where it would pay for itself, that he wouldn't have to pay for it. That's certainly the last thing he wanted, because, of course, he recognizes his father basically had been bankrupt and basically died poor, and Stephen F. Austin certainly did not want to repeat that process. However, after having sort of done the preliminary groundwork of setting up the colony, of trying to attract settlers, he was then told that all of his work was probably for nothing, because in 1821, the official treaty was signed between what we now know as Mexico and Spain, and Mexico became an independent country. So Moses Austin had gotten a land grant from the Spanish government, from basically Spain. But now you're dealing with another country, Mexico, and they had not given you this land grant. So, of course, originally this Texas area was in Spain, Spanish territory, New Spain, but with the signing of the Treaty of Cordoba, now this Texas area was in Mexico, and that meant that Mexico would not be honoring the contracts that the Spanish lent out, which, of course, presented problems to Stephen F. Austin, because he'd already spent some money on this venture in Texas, and he had already planned out, he was already advertising in newspapers to attract settlers. And so when he was told that Mexico would not honor this contract, he decided to go to Mexico City and try to get the Mexican government to honor the contract. Unfortunately, when he arrived, Mexico City was somewhat chaotic as far as the government was concerned. The Spanish were just basically leaving. The new Mexican government was taking shape. And of course, there was conflict between the Mexican government itself, between rich Mexicans, the Creoles and even the Mestizos, about what sort of government it should be. And so Austin basically spent a year in Mexico waiting for the Mexican government to materialize, waiting for the people there to create the government. While he was there, he spent his year well. He did not just perhaps go to tour sites, as you might say. Instead, he learned the language, he learned the laws, and he learned regulations, which would later serve him as an impresario, a person that was given a contract to bring settlers in to this area. So unlike some of us, when we have free time and we're just waiting for people to pick us up or something, Stephen F. Austin was using his time very wisely, educating himself, getting ready to use that education, so to speak, in order to create something new and something he hoped would be very successful. Eventually, the new Mexican government did materialize, and Austin received permission to move forward with the colonies. And although he dealt with setbacks and obstacles, he became the most successful impresario in Texas. So all of his time in Mexico City really paid off for him, learning the Spanish language. I mean, in a year, especially if you're immersed in the language, especially if everyone around you speaks the language and does not speak your language, you can pick up the language very quickly, obviously much more quickly than you can, for example, here in a Spanish class in school, where you spend 45 minutes in a Spanish class, and then maybe 10 or 15 minutes on homework that you say you spent 45 minutes on, and then you go around speaking, for example, English or whatever, the rest of the day. But when you're in a foreign land like Stephen F. Austin was, and for the entire year he was stuck there, and if he wanted anything, he was going to have to ask for it in Spanish, and so he learned Spanish because he was basically forced to in order to be successful. So finally, by 1823, a new law was passed that finally granted Austin a contract for his colony. Now, the 1823 law increased the amount of land granted to each settlers. So farmers and livestock ranchers could get 4,605 acres per family. Remember, Austin's plan was basically 640 acres per person, and then maybe 300 more plus for a wife, and maybe 100 more for a kid, which of course eventually would add up, especially if you had a lot of kids. So the 1823 law basically increased the amount of land you could get to 4,600 acres per family. And as an impresario, Austin was to receive 100,000 acres of land for himself. And from that 100,000 acres of land, he could sell that land to others, and then all of that money would go, not, for example, to the Mexican government, but to Stephen F. Austin. So Stephen F. Austin was going to be making money off this project, as well as bringing in settlers to Texas, which would help settle the area for Mexico, which was now the ruler of Texas. So if everything went well, everybody would be happy. Americans coming into Texas would be happy because instead of being in prison for bankruptcy in the United States, instead of being basically having nothing in the United States, now they would have a very nice farm, and they could produce a lot of food and wouldn't have to worry about being in poverty. And the Mexican government would be happy because this area was being settled finally, something, of course, Spain could really never do. And, of course, Austin would be happy because he was getting money, and everybody would be happy. So that's very rare in life to have everyone in the deal happy. Meanwhile, in Mexico, the two groups of basically rich Mexicans were still basically arguing it out over what type of government they should have. The Federalists were a group who believed in federal and state governments sharing power, and they formed the first Mexican Constitution. So the Federalists were in some ways wanting to be like the United States in our form of government. Of course, in the United States, we have a national government located in Washington, D.C., but every state has its own government and its own state capital. And we have a national law that people obey, but we also have state laws that people obey. So the Federalists basically wanted the same thing for Mexico. They wanted a national government, and they wanted state governments. Basically, they wanted the national government to be able to do everything the states couldn't do. And what the states could do, that would be the state power, and the national government wouldn't involve itself in the states in that regard. Now, the centralists basically thought that basically all the power should remain in the national government. That when you start spreading out power to the states, bad things are going to happen, the centralists thought. Some of those states are going to start breaking away from the central government. Every time one of the states doesn't like what you do, the centralists said they're going to start trying to break away and start their own country, which means we'll have to send out troops, which means our country will always be at war. So the centralists basically favored order over what they thought would be chaos, while the Federalists favored sort of, I wouldn't say individual rights, but at least states' rights over the national government's rights. And those two groups would continue battling it out in Mexico, really up until the modern Mexican Revolution in the 1920s. So the problem in Mexico City would not be solved anytime during Stephen F. Austin's lifetime. So in 1823 and 1824, a new colonization law allowing the states to make decisions about land grants was passed in 1824. So the law included certain federal restrictions. So now, at this point, Texas became joined with Coahuila to become one Mexican state. And even though Texans were not too happy about that, the people living in Texas and coming to Texas weren't too happy about that, that they wanted their own individual state in Mexico. Mexico, the national government at the time said, you know, once you get a large enough population, then you can become your own Mexican state. But until then, you're going to be joined with Coahuila, and the state capital will be in Saltillo, and you'll have to go there to do your business. And so eventually, Coahuila y Texas, Tejas, eventually also passed some of their own colonization laws with the goal of attracting settlers too. So of course, sometimes that can be confusing when you have the national government basically saying one thing and the state governments saying the other things. That can lead to some confusion, especially when you have a new group of people coming in and they're wondering, which set of laws should they obey? Which of course, you have a lot of new people coming in Texas, and they're wondering which set of laws should we obey. Now, so in the red, so the new state of Coahuila y Tejas is going to be in the red there. Of course, you see it's sort of a large piece of land. But of course, you have to remember at the time that when Mexico took over for Spain in North America, they also acquired large areas of land, which we now know as California and Arizona and New Mexico. And so Texas is not quite as big as it is today, but it still represents a big chunk of what was in Mexico. So in order to settle here, first of all, you had to have good conduct, whatever that meant. Basically, they didn't want people to cause trouble. But you really had to have three conditions to settle here in Texas at the time. You had to become a citizen of Mexico. So basically, you had to renounce, if you were coming from the United States, you had to renounce United States citizenship and proclaim citizenship in Mexico. You had to learn Spanish, because Spanish was the language of government and the Spanish language of commerce in obviously Mexico at the time and now. And you had to become a Catholic. So again, the plan of Iguala had stated, of course, one of those three guarantees was that Mexico would be a Catholic country, that the Catholic Church would have a lot of authority in that country. And so Texas being part of Mexico, when you came into Texas, you had to become a Roman Catholic, a Catholic. At least say you were. Now, of course, the first settlers in Texas, as we'll see, actually do all this. As time goes on, more and more settlers come into Texas and either do it just by saying it once and then forgetting all about it, or many settlers came in and simply didn't. Eventually, later settlers didn't learn Spanish, they didn't become Catholics, and they really didn't care about being a citizen of Mexico. But at first, when Stephen F. Austin started his colony, basically these three ideas apply, and when he brings in people, they basically do all three. And so, as we'll see, the Mexican government is going to be very pleased with Stephen F. Austin. So now, under this new contract, new law, a family can now obtain up to 4,428 acres of land for just $30. And the good part was, by the way, if you didn't have all the money, you could buy it on credit. You didn't actually have to have the money up front. And colonists would not have to pay general taxes for a set amount of time. So again, state law and national law varied, but supposedly it was going to be a 10-year period before taxes would kick in. So to attract people, basically you got a lot of land for very little or no money, and you didn't have to pay taxes on it. Which, by the way, American, even the state of Texas does that. I see they're attracting corporations like Telsa and other corporations from California and other places to Austin, and basically they're setting aside taxes for certainly the time, just like, of course, the Mexican government did with people moving to Texas in the 1820s and 30s. So most single men under this law would receive over 1,000 acres of land, which is probably more than one person could actually work. Another 3,321 acres of land would be given to them when they married. And of course, I'm assuming that you have 3,321. You have these odd numbers because, of course, the Spanish, the Mexicans were dealing with Spanish units of measurement, which were different than English units of measurement, and that's why you have some of these odd numbers. Interesting enough, a man who married a Mexican woman would receive a bonus of 1,000 acres of land. So if you're single, you could like marry, and that would bring you to your 4,300 plus acres of land. And then if you married a Mexican woman, and you were an Anglo male, that would bring you up to your 4,428 acres of land. So, fascinating. Now, Austin's original colony flourished. It did very well, and he began 4 more. So the Mexican government was so pleased with these first groups of settlers because they learned Spanish. They were loyal to Mexico. They became Catholics. They worked the land. They built up the farmstead. They built up their farms. They started trading. They did everything the Mexican government hoped they would do. And as a result, Stephen F. Austin was seen as a good guy as far as the Mexican government was concerned. Even though he might be an Anglo, even though he might originally have been from the United States, by this time Mexicans were saying, this guy is awesome. And as a result, he gets 4 more land grants from the Mexican government. So good timing, strong leadership, and access to lumber and water brought Austin great success as an impresario. So of course, first of all, he chose his land very wisely. He chose his land where there are rivers. He chose his land where there was a source of burning material for fires, but also a source of building material, of course, lumber, for example. So he rode around Texas and surveyed the area, and he chose his land that he got from the Mexican government very, very wisely. He basically sort of got the best picks out of all of it. So you can see there the original Austin colony, and then of course you can see some other Austins and Williams colonies. Austin 1827, of course his original colony was in 1821, and Austins and Williams in 1831. Of course you can also see some other colors as well. So there were other people who were going to be impresarios that were going to bring people to Texas. One of those people was Green DeWitt, who began a settlement close to Austin's original colony. But even though he said he would settle a certain number of people, he never was able to get that many people into his colony. And he always dealt with land disputes and federal restrictions. So some of the other landowners that were other impresarios were sort of claiming the same pieces of land that he had claimed. He was never able to bring everybody that he said he was going to bring. Still, he was the second most successful impresario in Texas, next to Stephen F. Austin. So Stephen F. Austin wasn't just doing it himself. He was not the only one bringing people and getting people to come to Texas in his Texas venture. Martin de Leon was actually a native Mexican. Of course, he had been obviously a Spaniard before he was a Mexican, because up until a few years before he came to Texas, Mexico was part of Spain. Nevertheless, he thought that he should be able to lead some people from what we now know as Mexico into Mexican Texas. So he wanted to lead them north. Of course, Austin and DeWitt and others were leading people from the United States, so they were basically leading them south and west. Martin de Leon basically was leading them north from Mexico. And under his settlement, he began the only settlement colonized mostly by Mexican families. So again, you can see where those colonies are in relationships to Austin colonies, and of course you can see where Austin colony is in regard to where we are today. So again, a lot of different people bringing people into Texas, not just Stephen F. Austin. Interesting enough, Moses Austin's daughter and eventually his grandson also came to Texas. It wasn't just Moses Austin's son, although Stephen F. Austin did most of the groundwork and did most of the impresarial contracts. Some of the other family of the Moses Austin, the guy that had died, eventually moved to Texas as well. Stillon was a successful cattle rancher and is considered the founder of the cattle industry in Texas, which is somewhat important in Texas. Farming was important in Texas and still is. Cattle were important in Texas and still are. So this starts right from really the very start of Mexican rule where they actually bring people in Texas, and they're successful in doing that much more so than the Spanish had been. The first 300 families brought into Texas by Austin have a special name. They're referred to as the Old 300, although some of the families were actually single males or a couple of people like put together to sort of list themselves as a family. But basically, the first 300 families brought to Texas are referred to as the Old 300. And again, the Mexican government was very, very pleased at the Old 300. They were hoping that all of the settlers moving into Texas were going to be just like the Old 300. Unfortunately, for Mexico, other settlers coming later would not be as good as the Old 300. Again, the settlers coming later would not learn Spanish. They would not become Mexican citizens. They would not become Roman Catholics. They tended to disregard Mexican law and many other things. So the Old 300s were sort of like a gold standard. They were like something that the Mexican government sort of looked up to and hoped that everybody coming in Texas would be like them. And for the most part, the Old 300 were wealthy and educated farmers. So many of the Old 300 families were coming to Texas for cheap land, and because they had been hurt economically by the Panic of 1819, many of these people were successful before they got into Texas. But oftentimes their success had been eroded or destroyed by the Panic of 1819, and that's why they were moving into Texas. So among successful people often recognize that simply because you fail does not make you a failure. Simply because you try something and it doesn't work once doesn't mean that it's not going to work again. Simply because you have experienced a setback doesn't mean that you'll always experience setbacks. So the Old 300 were a somewhat optimistic group of people that were very optimistic that whatever difficulties they had back in the United States, that those difficulties were not going to be repeated in Texas, and that they would have an even better life here in Texas than they had back in the United States. Of course, as I mentioned, some settlers came to Austin's colony to take advantage of cheap land. And some came to Texas to escape debt, and some just because to escape the law. And still others came because new lands appealed to their sense of adventure. So generally, sort of on junior high and high school tests, if they asked for 3 reasons why people came to Texas, you can't go wrong by saying they wanted cheap land, they wanted to escape debt, and they were looking for adventure. So those are sort of like 3 major reasons. Obviously not the only reasons, but 3 major reasons you should probably understand for future reference. That is a future quiz and future test. So as early as 1829, Mexico passed a law banning slavery. Now the Spanish had passed a law banning slavery as well. But as we'll see, Mexico will simply suspend the law as far as Texas was concerned. Because there had been so few people here in Texas, Mexico City was extremely anxious to build up this area to prevent other European powers or perhaps the United States from taking it over. So even though they had outlawed slavery, they temporarily suspended that for people in Texas because they felt that if they refused to allow any slaves in Texas, that people from the United States would quit coming, and that would mean that there'd be less and less people here in Texas, which means it'd be really easy for other European powers or the United States to take over. So the ban was not enforced in Mexican Texas. Although it was in fact enforced in Mexico, which means if you're a slave in Texas, if you can get to the Rio Grande River and get over the Rio Grande River, your chances are pretty good of being free. So the imperial colonization law outlawed the buying and selling of people. So of course we're used to films where you have the slave trade and you have basically people in chains that are being bought and sold. Now that was technically illegal in Texas. I'm not saying it didn't occur. Probably there were a few instances of where it did occur, but on the whole, you could bring your slaves in, but once you were here, you basically could not buy. You cannot buy new ones here in Texas, and you could basically not sell them here in Texas, generally. Even saying that, however, In 1825, about 1/4 of the Austin colony was made up of enslaved African Americans. However, there were also free African Americans that apparently came in under Austin's land grants or bought their freedom here in Texas as well. Interesting story of one young lady who earned her own freedom, who basically apparently was working for her master here in Texas, but also apparently the master allowed her to keep part of her proceeds, her pay, and so eventually after a couple of years she was able to buy her freedom, and then she married a free African-American barber that lived here in Texas, who apparently had come in under an Austin land grant and had never been a slave, at least not here in Texas. And eventually and he owned about 100 acres and 4 lots in the town of Brazoria. And interesting enough, they also owned like 4 enslaved people. Records don't show whether those enslaved people were part of her family. Of course, sometimes that was the case in areas that, having a former slave, you would actually buy or basically enslave your daughter or son, so they would not be part of the slave trade. That is, you could keep them in your family. That was a legal way of keeping them in your family. But also, of course, it could have been just that this couple that had been former slaves, at least one of them had been a former slave, needed people to work on their land as well. But there are interesting stories all around the Austin colony about people coming in for various different reasons, both blacks and whites, and what we now know as Hispanics, and even a few from other countries that were already coming in other land grants. So this entire period is really interesting for historians because there's a lot of different personal stories of people trying to adapt to this new frontier, trying to build a new life for themselves, and trying to become successful in life. So women played an important role in the colonies of Texas, even though they had few rights. So women could not vote or hold office here. But while men were away, and they often were, because the farms tend to be very large, the cattle ranches tend to be very large, and of course business, if you needed to go to the state capital, it wasn't here in what we now know as Texas, it was in what we now know as Mexico, so you had to travel great distances. So women were responsible for the farm while they were gone. They were also responsible for child rearing. Eventually, of course, apparently women could operate businesses as well here in Texas. So again, it's a very interesting period, a period of flux between a lot of people that didn't have freedom and a lot of people that are sort of getting their freedom, or at least getting a few rights when they had basically none somewhere else. There were no public schools in the colony of Texas. Wealthy families sent their children to school in the United States or employed tutors. So sometimes they brought in rich teachers. They brought in teachers. The rich people brought in those teachers and paid them to live on their farms or sort of estates. But oftentimes, kids here in Texas from wealthy families were actually sent back to the United States, usually to New Orleans, but sometimes along into the East Coast as well. Now, eventually, many of the colonies, like the DeWitt colony and Austin colonies, they started to open rudimentary schools that sometimes were on and off. There was never any mandatory school law that said you had to send your kids to school, and there's never any mandatory law that said they had to be in school for certain days. So at the very first, as Texas was opening up to colonization, was opening up to Austin's colonies and other colonies, young people especially generally had to help their parents work on the farms and in the cattle ranches, especially in the early stages, unless the family was already very wealthy, because again, the land grants tend to be really large, which is really good because eventually you could grow a lot of crops or raise a lot of cattle and make a lot of money, but you needed help. And so often young people, for example, young people like you viewing me, would actually be working during your day instead of going to school. And some of you might think, oh, that's great. Well, it's not too great because you didn't actually get paid for work because you were working for your family. And second of all, your work day was usually longer than the school day. And also, after working for many years, you would not have an education. So if you hope to move to someplace higher in life, higher position in life, you were going to have to acquire that education later in life anyway. But nevertheless, the Mexican government opening up Texas to various impresarios who brought in different people, filling this area with people. So within a very few short years, the Mexican government had managed to bring in a lot more people than the Spanish had in over 300 years. So at first, it seemed, as far as the Mexican government was concerned, it was a success story. But you know, sometimes life is like that. At first, sometimes it seems like we're doing all right, little realizing that trouble lays ahead, or trouble lies ahead, I guess I should say. Anyway, we'll look at that trouble later on. Thank you for watching. Have a good day.